Her daughter-in-law was upstairs with a tape measure, while Helen Grant stood graveside, saying goodbye to her husband of 41 years. Melissa never shed a tear, just circled the dining room like a contractor. By sunrise, the house was sold, the deed transferred, and Helen's move was already scheduled. They'd expected her to grieve quietly and hand over the keys, but Helen had buried her husband, not her authority. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The ground gave under Helen's heels like a held breath finally released. April had turned the cemetery slick and green, the grass shining with a damp that seeped into the seams of her black pumps. She kept her shoulders squared and her chin etched straight, fingers locked on the damp paper program that still smelled faintly of printer ink. The pastor's words floated and thinned. Comforting for some, she supposed. For her, they were surface noise. Beneath it, there was the quiet thunder of all the rooms at home that would never hear his footsteps again. A gust shivered through the cluster of mourners. Someone sniffed. Someone squeezed her elbow and said, "He was a good man, Helen." She nodded like she believed the sky was blue. She didn't trust her mouth to do more. Across the headstones, Cedar Falls looked almost pretty. Trees fuzzed with early leaves, houses cupped close together, the town lean and plain and honest about it. She had lived here long enough to know exactly who would bring a casserole and exactly who would bring questions disguised as sympathy. Today, they were both generous. David stood on her left, tall and pale, the collar of his shirt too tight. He kept patting her back in short, nervous taps, as if grief might bolt and he needed to keep it tethered. Melissa, on his other side, wore a sleek black coat and sunglasses even though the sun had never bothered to show up. Her mouth was pinched in a way that wasn't sorrow. When the last clod of dirt thumped down, Helen reached out and laid the single white rose. It felt theatrical, but she couldn't think of anything else to do with her hands. Back at the house, the warmth hit like a soft slap. Coffee brewing, something cinnamon, the hush of people trying not to speak too loudly in a room that had heard laughter 1,000 times louder. Her Victorian place had never looked more itself. Oak banister polished to a satin sheen, the oval mirror in the foyer catching and returning every face, the rugs she and Henry had picked up in little Iowa towns that sold quilts and biscuits with equal pride. The parlor had been turned into a buffet line, ham sandwiches with a ribbon of mustard, carrot sticks sweating onto glass, a bowl of green grapes gleaming like glass marbles. "Eat, Helen," Carla said, pressing a paper plate toward her. Carla's bracelets chimed like soft silver bells, her voice that perfect cafe mix of bossy and kind. "You're going to fall over." "I will," Helen lied. She moved through her rooms with a hostess's muscle memory and a widow's float, hugging shoulders, accepting murmurs, watching as people smiled at things Henry loved. His model train on the bookshelf, the ceramic spaniel on the mantel that he insisted was so ugly it's dignified. The house took them in the way a person breathes. She glimpsed Melissa near the dining room archway, speaking in a hushed animated thread to 2 women from the gym, one manicured hand cutting through the air. When Melissa lifted her sunglasses to her hair like a headband, Helen realized her daughter-in-law's eyes were perfectly dry. Helen carried her own coffee into the kitchen for refuge. The fluorescent hum overhead traced the old rhythm of mornings. Memory rose without permission. Henry at the table, a smear of jam on his thumb, arguing with the radio. "If they raise property taxes again, I swear." "Mom?" David hovered in the doorway, phone already half out. Do you want me to?" His eyes skittered around the countertops like there was something to organize. "Melissa's been trying to help, but, you know." "I know," she said. And she did. She touched his wrist. "Go talk to your friends. I'm fine." He kissed her cheek and returned to the front of the house, grateful to be sent toward a solvable problem. Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd stored. "Sorry for intruding, Mrs. Grant." The voice came soft as flannel. Tommy Harris leaned a shoulder against the back porch door, hands tucked into the pockets of his navy windbreaker. 70 and wiry, he had a mechanic's hands and a magpie memory. Nothing shiny escaped him. He slid his gaze toward the ceiling, then back to her face. Just wanted to say, noticed your daughter-in-law headed upstairs a few minutes ago. Didn't look lost." Helen blinked. The kitchen clock ticked in the gap. "Thank you, Tommy." She smoothed the front of her dress. I'll make sure the upstairs bathroom has towels." "You do that." He tipped an invisible cap and vanished back into the murmur. Helen set her coffee down so carefully the mug didn't even whisper against the counter. Upstairs. Of course she was. Helen felt the old house like a second body. She could tell when a door closed or a drawer slid. She hated the idea, other feet, other eyes, on the private cloth of her rooms. But the shame of policing her own guests at her husband's funeral kept her tongue still. She waited, counted the creaks. People came and went. Condolences rose and fell like a tide. Melissa appeared in the dining room again at some point, fingertips drifting along the edge of the buffet with a proprietary air, then disappeared into the cluster by the foyer where Sharon Lewis stood, crisp in a pinstripe blazer, hair swept back and immovable. Sharon gave Helen a small, steady look across the room, one of those looks that said, "I'm here, just say the word." Helen felt the corner of her mouth twitch in gratitude. By late afternoon, the house had thinned. The last of the casseroles were labeled and stacked in the freezer. The sunlight leaked gray, and the rooms took on that hollow aftersound a party leaves behind. David hugged her and promised to check in later. Melissa air-kissed the space beside Helen's cheek and said, "We'll talk about everything," her tone implying a shared project, an inevitability. When the front door closed behind them, the quiet was a drop. Helen stood in it, letting it settle around her shoulders. Then she went upstairs. The landing smelled of lemon oil and the faint, powdery trace of her perfume. The door to the guest room stood half a finger's breadth open. She pushed it with a knuckle, eyes tracking the bedspread, smooth, and the dresser. Nothing out of place, before a small, unnatural note in the tableau snagged her attention. On her own bed, Henry's side, lay a coiled tape measure. Yellow, cheap, the metal mouth gaping like a grin. She didn't touch it at first. She looked around as if there might be a second explanation in the corners or under the chair. The curtains at the windows, heavy floral she'd had custom-made 15 years ago, lined so the winter cold kept its distance, hung innocent and obvious, the hem brushing the radiator covers in a way she'd always loved. Her fingers went to the fabric without permission. She pinched a pleat, rubbed it between finger and thumb, memorizing a texture she'd chosen with him. This room was a ledger of decisions made together. She picked up the tape measure. It was warm from a living hand. A sound rose in her like a tide, not quite a laugh, not quite a groan. In the mirror above the dresser, a woman met her eyes, a woman with a face she recognized but had never seen angled this way before. Widowed and measured, she thought, and the thought was clean as glass. She pressed the tape back into her palm until the edge nicked her skin and imagined, briefly, vividly, the sight of Melissa's manicured thumb holding it, pulling it along a hem, calculating. Not grief, logistics. Helen set the tape on the nightstand with precision. Downstairs the phone buzzed, a text bright against the quiet house. She could already guess the shape of it. David or Melissa, smoothing, explaining, turning help into a favor she should be grateful for. Helen stood very still in the doorway of her room, eyes on the curtained window and the street beyond it, where the little brick house across the way sat tidy as a thought waiting to be thought. Her pulse steadied to something that wasn't mourning. She went downstairs to read the message, the decision blooming so quickly it felt like memory. On her bed, the tape measure waited, mouth open. The kitchen was too quiet for a house that had been full just an hour ago. Helen sat at the table with her hands around a mug gone cold, staring at the knot in the wood near her left elbow. The knot had always looked like a small, startled eye, but tonight it looked more like it was winking at her, sharing some private joke she didn't quite have the heart for. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than it had in years. From the dining room came the faint scent of mustard and ham, a ghost of the funeral crowd. She could still picture the last guest's hand slipping off the doorknob, the echo of the latch clicking, the air settling heavy in its place. Melissa's voice was the only one that lingered in her head. "We'll talk about everything." That slight, bright tilt at the end, like a realtor telling you the wallpaper was full of potential. Helen rolled the words in her mind, hearing them over the thrum of the fridge, over the low moan of wind in the flue. Her phone buzzed. She didn't check right away, letting it trill once more before she reached for it. David's name. Melissa just wants to help. The period at the end made it worse. Firm, tidy, no room for discussion. Helen set the phone face down on the table, a little harder than necessary. She knew the will's wording by heart. The property at 124 Oak Street to remain solely in the name of Helen Marie Grant, without lien or co-ownership. Henry had been meticulous about it, not because they'd thought Melissa was a threat back then, but because they'd believed in leaving the living as much certainty as the dead could offer. Still, the memory of Melissa's hands, those manicured, deliberate fingers, curling a tape measure against fabric Helen had chosen with Henry's laughter still in her ears, that stuck like a burr. The front screen creaked. Helen turned toward the sound and saw Sharon Lewis in the doorway, holding a paper bag and a bottle of wine like she'd just come from a less somber gathering. Sharon didn't knock. She never had. "Thought you might need something that isn't a casserole," Sharon said, setting the bag on the counter. She wore her pinstripe blazer still, the collar lifted slightly from the wind. "I've got enough to feed the National Guard," Helen said, rising to meet her. Sharon tilted her head, studying her face the way only an old friend could, taking in the set of the jaw, the faint tremor in the hands. "You look like you're running a chessboard in your head," she said, sliding the wine bottle free. Helen leaned against the counter, the cool tile at her back. "Melissa was upstairs today, in my bedroom." Sharon's eyes sharpened. "Looking for what?" Helen told her about the tape measure, each word tasting cleaner and colder than the last. "Good God," Sharon murmured. She poured them each a glass without asking, her motions neat, economical. "What are you thinking?" Helen took the glass but didn't drink right away. She let the weight of it balance in her palm, the stem pressing between her fingers. She thought about the little brick house across the street, the one she'd noticed through her bedroom window earlier, neat as a pressed shirt. She thought about Melissa pacing upstairs, mentally redecorating rooms that weren't hers to change. A flicker of something, not anger exactly, but sharper, settled under Helen's ribs. "I think," she said slowly, "I know exactly how to deal with this." Sharon didn't push for details. She only raised her glass in a quiet toast, her eyes gleaming with the kind of trust that came from decades of shared history. Helen clinked her glass gently against Sharon's, the sound small but decisive. In the corner of the kitchen, her phone lit up again with David's name, buzzing once, twice, before falling dark. She didn't reach for it. The air in the room felt different now, less heavy, more alive. The clock above the sink ticked on, steady as a metronome. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed and a pair of footsteps moved down the sidewalk. Helen didn't need to look to know who it was. She smiled, not the polite smile she'd given mourners all day, but something narrower, more deliberate, then took a slow sip of her wine. Helen waited until the second glass of wine was gone before she spoke. Not about Henry, not about the funeral, about the house. "You've still got your laptop in the car, don't you?" she asked. Sharon narrowed her eyes just enough to show she understood the real question. "Of course I do." "Run the numbers," Helen said, her voice low but steady. "Quietly. Tonight, if you can." For a moment, Sharon didn't move. Then she reached for her blazer pocket, tugged out a slim leather notebook instead of the laptop. She always wrote before she typed. An old habit from when real estate deals were sealed with handshakes and coffee, not encrypted PDFs. "What's your hurry?" she asked, pen poised. Helen rested her elbows on the counter, fingers twined together. "Melissa's in a hurry. That's enough for me." Sharon's pen scratched across the page. "Market's red hot right now," she said. "A Victorian this size in this neighborhood with original woodwork. You could have a cash offer before the week's out." "That's what I'm counting on," Helen said. "But they—" She didn't need to name David and Melissa. "Can't know until the ink is dry." Sharon gave her a long, level look. "You're talking about a sale from start to finish without a whisper leaking out. That's tight timing." "I don't need a parade," Helen said. "Just one clean transaction." From the porch came the faint creak of boards shifting. Then a shuffle, deliberate, like someone taking an extra second to listen through the door. Helen and Sharon traded a glance. "I'll go," Sharon murmured, but Helen shook her head and walked over herself. When she swung open the door, Tommy Harris stood with a paper bag from the corner store, the sort of casual prop a man uses when he wants to look like he just happened by. "Evening, ladies," he said, his gaze moving between them with a neighbor's unassuming ease. But the little quirk in his mouth told Helen he'd heard enough to have an opinion. "Need something, Tommy?" she asked. "Just thought you might be running low on milk," he said, holding up the bag like proof of goodwill. Then, softer, "If you're doing what I think you're doing, I can keep an eye out. She," he didn't bother saying Melissa's name, "is nosy as a raccoon in a garbage can." Helen felt the corners of her mouth twitch. "I'll keep that in mind." Sharon's laugh was a short, approving exhale. "We may just take you up on that." Tommy tipped an imaginary cap and disappeared into the dusk. Back inside, Sharon was already flipping her notebook closed. "Let me pull comps first thing in the morning. You keep going about your life like you don't have a thing on your mind." But Helen did have something on her mind. As Sharon talked square footage and recent sales, her eyes drifted toward the staircase, toward the upper floor where Melissa's measuring had cut into the air like a knife. She pictured opening closets, deciding what mattered enough to follow her and what could be left for strangers. She saw herself folding Henry's navy sweater into a box, sliding the framed photo of their first road trip between layers of tissue, tucking away the little carved owl he'd bought at a flea market because it looked wise enough to run for mayor. The rest, the heavy china set Melissa had once called outdated, the guest bed she never liked, even the curtains Melissa had coveted, could stay. She would strip the house down to her history and leave the rest as a blank canvas for someone else's life. Sharon's voice brought her back. "Helen, you with me?" "I'm thinking about what comes next," Helen said. Sharon studied her for a beat, then nodded. "Good. Just remember, silence is your ally right now." The mantel clock in the living room chimed the hour. Outside, the wind carried the faint metallic rattle of a chain-link gate, then stilled. Helen imagined Melissa in her own kitchen across town, tapping her nails against the counter, certain her future here was safe. Helen tightened her grip around the wineglass stem. In her mind, she was already packing the first box. And she knew exactly where it would go. Sharon's office smelled faintly of lemon polish and the paper tang of old file folders. The blinds were half drawn, letting in a thin slice of late-morning sun that striped the carpet in pale gold. Helen sat in the chair opposite her friend's desk, the leather soft from decades of clients leaning forward to sign their lives into motion. The purchase agreement was a tidy stack of papers, nothing about it betraying the fact that this decision was seismic. Sharon flipped each page toward her, sliding a pen across the desk. "You're sure?" Sharon asked, not for doubt's sake, but as ritual. Helen didn't hesitate. She bent over the first page and signed with a flourish that felt almost theatrical. The scratch of ink on paper was both louder and quieter than she expected. By the time they reached the last page, Sharon's phone had already pinged twice, interested buyers. "Told you," she said with a quick smile. "Market's a Shark Tank right now." It took less than an hour. A cash buyer, an older couple from Des Moines who'd been looking for something with character, agreed to her price without haggling. Closing by Friday. Sharon leaned back in her chair, eyebrows arched. "That's the fastest I've ever seen you move." Helen smiled faintly. "I've had practice making up my mind." When they shook hands across the desk, it wasn't the perfunctory kind. It was firm, anchored, two women sealing something more than a transaction. The offer came with a note. The buyers wanted most of the furniture. Helen pictured the dining table where she and Henry had played cards, the armchair molded to his shape, even the heavy buffet Melissa had once called a relic. She surprised herself by feeling no pang. "They can have it," she said. "All of it if they want." That afternoon, she moved through the house like a curator, selecting artifacts for a private collection. The navy sweater, the owl, a box of photographs Henry had once threatened to burn because of his bad 1970s haircut. She wrapped each piece carefully, stacking boxes in a quiet corner of the study. She passed by the curtains in the living room without touching them. Let them stay. Let Melissa see them through someone else's windows. By the third box, she needed air. She stepped out onto the porch and leaned against the railing, feeling the wood warm from the noon sun. Across the street, the small brick house she'd noticed before sat with a neat "for sale" sign staked in its front lawn. The bricks glowed a deep, sunburnt red against the trim of white shutters, the yard clipped to a perfect rectangle. Helen stared at it, head tilted slightly, the way a person studies a painting they're not ready to admit they love. The phone was in her hand before she'd decided to pick it up. She scrolled to Sharon's name. When her friend answered, Helen didn't bother with pleasantries. "What's the story on that one?" There was a beat of silence. Then Sharon's voice sharpened with interest. "Across the street? I'll find out." Helen stayed on the porch, eyes fixed on the brick house, imagining the light in its rooms, the way the curtains, her curtains, would never hang there. The brick house smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet, like someone had baked cookies in the last 24 hours just to make it more welcoming. Helen stepped through the front door, her hand brushing the smooth, freshly painted trim. The light poured in through wide windows, falling across hardwood floors without a single scuff. "This is manageable," she murmured, more to herself than to Sharon, who trailed a few steps behind with a clipboard. It was smaller than her Victorian, half the rooms, none of the drafty corners. The kitchen was bright and square, counters gleaming, cabinets painted a soft cream. Helen imagined her coffee mug sitting by the sink, morning light catching the steam. No staircase to creak under unwelcome feet, no guest rooms to tempt opportunistic relatives. They moved into the living room, where a modest brick fireplace sat like a steady friend. "Perfect size for one person," Sharon said, flipping a page. "Yard's easy upkeep, roof's new, no foundation issues. Honestly, it's a unicorn in this market." Helen walked slowly down the short hall, peeking into each bedroom. One would be hers, the other she thought could be a cozy study. Her fingers grazed the doorframe, and she felt that quiet click inside her, the one that told her when a decision had already been made. Back in the living room, she didn't sit before speaking. "Let's make an offer." Sharon's pen hovered. "Part of the proceeds from Oak Street?" Helen nodded. "Cash, no contingencies." It was done in minutes. By the end of the day, Sharon had lined up a perfect storm of timing, the closing on her Victorian in the morning, the brick house in the afternoon. No gap, no stray days for Melissa to sniff out an opportunity. When Tommy heard, he leaned over the fence like they were co-conspirators in a spy movie. "Got my truck ready," he said. "We'll load up what you want at dawn and be gone before she knows which way's up." Helen allowed herself a smile. Exactly the plan. The rest of the week, she moved like someone playing both hostess and thief, keeping the rhythm of everyday life in place while quietly dismantling it. She still answered Melissa's calls, still listened to David's small talk, even let Melissa ramble about kitchen renovations when the time comes. Helen kept her responses warm, measured. "That's an idea," she'd say, or, "We'll see." In the evenings, she packed. Sharon's garage became a vault for her boxes, things that mattered, things Melissa would never lay eyes on again. By Thursday night, the Victorian still looked perfectly lived in. The china was still in the hutch, the floral curtains still in place, the guest beds still made. Helen had left them all for the new owners, exactly as they'd wanted. Friday morning came cold and clear. Sharon met her at the title office with 2 folders, one for each closing. Helen signed away the Victorian without flinching. The buyers, smiling and eager, shook her hand warmly. They didn't know or care about the drama baked into the bricks they'd just bought. By lunchtime, she had the keys to the brick house in her palm. The metal was cool, unassuming. Tommy's truck was already half-loaded when she got back. He tipped his cap. "We're ahead of schedule." Across the street, Melissa's SUV rolled up. Helen waved like she had nothing bigger in her day than watering the geraniums. Melissa got out, her gaze fixed on the Victorian, no doubt expecting to be invited in to talk future plans. Helen kept her tone easy. "Good timing, I was just heading out." Melissa blinked. "Heading out where?" Helen smiled. Oh, just across the street. An hour later, from her new porch, Helen watched Melissa walk up to the Victorian with a curious expression, only to be greeted by strangers holding her old keys. Helen moved through the house with the deliberate precision of someone dismantling a life without disturbing its outward appearance. In the study, the faint scent of old paper and furniture polish lingered, as though the room itself was holding its breath. She knelt beside the bottom drawer of the oak desk where Henry had kept the things he considered too important or too private for the attic. The navy sweater lay folded at the bottom, its wool still holding a trace of cedar from years in storage. She smoothed her hand over it once before placing it into a box lined with tissue paper, arranging it so the collar sat neatly at the top. The carved owl followed, its wooden surface cool beneath her fingertips. She remembered the day Henry had found it at a flea market and declared it wise enough to run for mayor, and for a moment her throat tightened. Still, she wrapped it in a towel and laid it beside the sweater. By late morning, the study shelves stood mostly bare except for a set of encyclopedias she had no desire to move. She left them where they were, the dust along the top edges undisturbed. From there, she carried an empty box to the bedroom. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed released a faint, comforting aroma when she lifted the lid. Inside were quilts, some she had sewn herself, others inherited from her mother, each folded with care years ago. She layered them gently into the box, pressing the folds down so they would fit together. The jewelry box came next, its tiny brass latch clicking shut before she wrapped it in one of Henry's old flannel shirts. The bed itself, with its solid oak frame and matching end tables, she left untouched. Even the lamps Henry had rewired one summer when money was tight remained in place. The curtains at the windows, the same floral ones Melissa had been so interested in measuring, hung exactly as they always had, their hems brushing the radiator covers in the familiar way Helen had loved for 15 years. She had no intention of taking them. They would stay here for the new owners, and Melissa would never have the satisfaction of claiming them. Her phone chimed from the dresser, and she glanced at the screen to see Melissa's name. "I can swing by later to help pack if you want." The words were dressed up as kindness, but Helen could hear the curiosity beneath them, could picture the way Melissa's eyes would move over every object, cataloging what stayed and what went. She typed back, "Thank you, but I've got it handled." She didn't soften the message with an emoji or a smile. By midday, she had the first load ready for Sharon's garage. Tommy arrived with his old blue pickup, the bed lined with a tarp to keep the boxes clean. They worked quietly, carrying each load down the walk. He didn't ask what was in them. He didn't have to. Once they were stacked in Sharon's garage, she reminded Helen, 2 days, then we move it all into the brick house. Keep the pace steady, no reason for anyone to notice a thing." That afternoon, Helen returned to the Victorian and pulled the blinds in the front rooms. She knew Melissa well enough to expect curiosity, and within a few hours her instincts were confirmed. Just before sunset, Tommy called. "She's been out there most of the afternoon, walked past your house twice, then stopped at the mailbox and pretended to sort through envelopes 3 times in an hour." Helen could picture it with perfect clarity. Melissa in her fitted jacket, the air of casualness not quite covering the sharp, assessing glances toward the house. Helen didn't bother to look out. Instead, she taped another box shut, wrote "kitchen," fragile in careful letters, and slid it onto the growing stack by the door. When the street lamps flickered on, the house felt heavier, though not with sadness. She moved into the living room and stood for a long moment, her gaze moving over the antique mirror, the mantel clock, the photographs still on the walls. All of these would remain here, just as the buyers had wanted, creating the illusion that nothing had changed. But she knew her life was already elsewhere, packed, hidden, and safe. Upstairs, she stepped into the bedroom one last time for the night. The curtains swayed slightly at the window, stirred by the cool breeze from the inch-wide gap she had left. She crossed the room, straightened the fabric with a practiced hand, and let it fall back into place. From the street, it would appear exactly as it always had, the house giving nothing away. What Melissa didn't realize was that the most important parts of Helen's life were no longer here, and by the time she found out, it would be far too late. Helen was coming up the front walk with a paper sack from the market when she spotted Melissa across the street, angled toward the Victorian like a moth fixed on a porch light. The late afternoon sun caught the gold in her hair, but her expression was tight. Her sunglasses pushed up on her head so Helen could see her eyes narrowing in a question she hadn't yet asked. They met at the sidewalk in a half measure of politeness, close enough for conversation, but not so close that Melissa could peer past Helen into the shadowed rooms. "I've noticed some people in and out of the house lately," Melissa began, her tone casual on the surface, though her voice had that brittle brightness Helen had learned to recognize as thin ice. "Who are they?" Helen shifted the grocery bag in her arms and let her mouth curve into something between a smile and a shrug. "Oh, just friends visiting, helping me with a few things." Melissa's gaze lingered a fraction too long, as though she were trying to read the fine print in Helen's tone. "Friends?" she repeated, softer now, skeptical. "That's right," Helen said, and before Melissa could press, she added, "Well, I'd better get these put away before the milk warms." With that, she stepped past, keys already in hand, the conversation as neatly closed as a door latch. Inside, she set the groceries on the counter and took a moment to lean against the cool edge of the sink, letting her shoulders drop. Melissa's persistence was expected, but the timing meant she was circling closer than Helen would like. Her phone buzzed. David's name lit the screen. "Hey, Mom," he said when she answered, the easy cadence of his voice not quite masking a purpose. "Melissa said there were people around the house. Just wanted to check in, see if everything's all right." Helen dried her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the dining room window, looking out at the elm trees just starting to leaf. "Everything's fine," she said, her tone light. "I picked up some wonderful peaches at the market today. You should stop by later this week. I'll make cobbler." "Sure, but—" "Henry always loved cobbler," she continued smoothly, "especially with ice cream. You remember that summer we—" She let the memory spool out, weaving past whatever question he'd meant to ask until his voice had settled back into neutral agreement. By the time she hung up, she could almost hear the quiet on his end, a son not entirely convinced but unwilling to press further. As she was sliding the peaches into the fruit bowl, her other phone, the one she kept on the kitchen counter for Sharon's calls, rang. "Got confirmation," Sharon said without preamble. "Your new keys will be ready tomorrow morning. We'll meet at the brick house first thing." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the words like warm air after a storm. "Tomorrow," she repeated, the syllables steady and certain. That night, she moved through her bedtime routine without the knot of tension that had been lodged under her ribs for weeks. No pacing from room to room, no glancing out the window to see if Melissa's car was idling nearby. She slipped between the cool sheets and lay still, listening to the house settle around her. The steady tick of the mantel clock downstairs marked the seconds in a rhythm that seemed to line up with her breathing. Her mind wasn't on the Victorian anymore, nor on Melissa's sharp glances. It was on the brick house across the street, the rooms already imagined in her mind, the air inside untouched by anyone else's plans. For the first time in weeks, Helen slept straight through until morning, unbroken, dreamless, and entirely her own. What she didn't know was that, just after midnight, a car had slowed in front of the Victorian, idled for a full minute, then driven on. The knock came sharp and fast, not the hesitant kind that asked permission to enter. Helen had just set her coffee cup on the porch railing when the front gate banged open, and Melissa strode up the walk as though she owned every plank of it. Her hair was swept back in a severe knot, and she wore a fitted blazer in a shade too bright for morning, like she had dressed for battle. "I'm going to ask you one time," Melissa began before she even reached the top step, "and I expect an honest answer. What is going on with that house?" She jabbed a manicured finger toward the Victorian across the street. Helen stayed seated in the wicker chair, her posture relaxed, both hands cradling her mug as though the only urgency in her day was keeping the coffee warm. "Which part are you asking about?" she said evenly. "The part where strangers are coming and going, and no one in this family knows why." Melissa's voice pitched higher, carrying out toward the sidewalk. "The part where I find out from a neighbor that you've been moving things out. The part where—" "It's sold," Helen said, her tone as calm as if she were reporting the weather. Melissa blinked. The momentum of her indignation faltered for a fraction of a second before roaring back. "Sold? To who? When? How could you? Without telling us?" Helen lifted her coffee, took a slow sip, and let the warmth settle before answering. "I signed the papers last week. Closing was yesterday morning. It's theirs now." "That's not how this works." Melissa's voice cracked on the last word. "That house is part of this family's legacy. David grew up there. His father. Your husband." She stopped, drawing in a sharp breath as if summoning the weight of the past to back her argument. "We should have been part of the conversation. At the very least, you owed us that." "I don't owe you anything about this house," Helen said, still without raising her voice. "It's mine. Bought and paid for in full. Henry made sure of that." Melissa's eyes flared. "This is spiteful. You're doing this to punish me, too." "No." Helen set her cup down on the small table beside her and met Melissa's gaze squarely. "Just decisive." The words hung in the air between them, cool and immovable. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed again. Her gaze darted toward the Victorian, where the new owners were unloading a rug from the back of a van, laughing as they maneuvered it toward the front door. "Do you even know these people?" she asked finally, her voice dropping but her anger no less raw. "They're nice," Helen said. "They like the house as it is. They even wanted the curtains." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the wicker as Helen leaned back. Melissa's breathing was quick, her hands clenching at her sides, the pulse visible at the base of her throat. "This isn't over," Melissa said, her voice low now, the heat gone cold. Helen picked up her coffee again. "It is for me." Melissa turned on her heel, the click of her heels sharp against the wood steps, and stalked down the walk without looking back. From her chair, Helen watched her cross the street, shoulders stiff, her stride clipped with restrained fury. She didn't move until Melissa disappeared around the corner, only then letting her gaze drift back to the brick house's sunny living room window, where the light fell in a soft square on the floor she would soon call her own. Somewhere deep inside, the knot of tension eased another notch, but she knew Melissa well enough to understand this morning was only the first round. The morning of the move broke clear and bright, the kind of crisp light that made every detail feel sharpened. Helen stood at the edge of her driveway, her breath curling faintly in the air, watching Tommy back his pickup into place. The bed of the truck was already lined with a quilt to protect the boxes, and the tailgate bore the dings and scuffs of decades of hard work. "Let's start with the heavy ones first," Tommy said, climbing out and rolling his shoulders like a man ready to lift more than just boxes. Helen nodded and carried the first load, a carton marked Books, HG in her neat script, down the walk. They worked without fuss, the rhythm easy between them. Helen handing off, Tommy stacking with care, the two of them moving like a pair of people who'd done favors for each other for years without keeping score. Across the street, Melissa stood on her porch, arms folded tight against her chest. She wasn't wearing sunglasses this time. Her glare was unobstructed, tracking every box as though each one contained a secret she was being denied. Helen felt the weight of that stare but didn't grant it more than a passing acknowledgement, a polite, distant wave before turning back to Tommy. Neighbors paused in their routines to wave or call out encouragement. Mrs. Phelps from 2 doors down shouted, "Congratulations on the new place, Helen," and lifted a hand high in the air. Even the mailman offered a quick, knowing nod as he passed. The warmth from those gestures was a quiet counterbalance to the frost radiating from Melissa's porch. By mid-morning, the last of Helen's chosen belongings were in Tommy's truck, the back gate secured with a bungee cord. She locked the Victorian's front door without ceremony, the key turning smooth and final in her hand, then slipped it into her pocket for the very last time. The brick house seemed to open itself to her as soon as she stepped across its threshold. The air inside was cool and faintly scented with fresh paint. Sunlight spilled across the living room floor in generous patches, lighting up the polished wood. It was quieter than she had imagined, no creak of stairs, no echo of other footsteps, just the solid, private silence she'd been craving. Not long after she and Tommy unloaded the last box, a knock sounded at the front door. When she opened it, Carla from the cafe stood there, holding a woven basket wrapped in clear cellophane. "Housewarming," Carla said with a smile. "Figured you could use something sweet after a morning like this." Inside the basket, Helen spotted a jar of homemade jam, a loaf of crusty bread, and a tin of butter cookies. "That's kind of you," Helen said, genuinely touched. She set the basket on the kitchen counter, promising to stop by the cafe soon. Once the house quieted again, she turned her attention to a single box she'd placed on the coffee table. She lifted the lid and began unpacking Henry's favorite books, dog-eared paperbacks, a few hardcovers with his scrawled notes in the margins. She arranged them on the small built-in shelf beside the fireplace, her fingers lingering on the cracked spines. It was the first real act of making this house hers. She had just stepped back to look at the row of books when her phone rang. It was Sharon. "You'll want to hear this," Sharon said without preamble. "Melissa's been on the phone all morning trying to get the sale reversed. Claimed you weren't in your right mind when you signed the papers." Helen let out a slow, measured breath. And she's got no standing," Sharon replied, her voice edged with satisfaction. "House was solely yours, every legal document in order. She's wasting her time." Helen looked around at the brick house, its sunlit rooms and quiet corners. "Good," she said simply. From the front window, she could see Melissa's SUV parked at the curb, engine idling. Even at this distance, Helen could tell her daughter-in-law was on the phone, her free hand slicing the air in frustration. Helen reached for the curtain cord, drew the fabric closed, and let the peaceful dimness settle over the room. Outside, the engine revved, but Helen didn't move toward the window again. She had no need to see Melissa drive away. Helen was halfway through her first cup of coffee the next morning when her phone rang, Sharon's name lighting the screen. She set the mug down on the porch rail, the air cool enough that she could see the faint swirl of steam as she answered. "You're going to love this," Sharon said, her voice carrying the dry amusement of someone about to deliver gossip that was too good to keep. Melissa tried again. Helen eased back into her chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Again?" This time she went straight for the jugular, told the buyer's attorney you weren't mentally fit to sign the sales agreement, said you'd been acting erratic, making impulsive decisions, probably under emotional distress from the funeral. Sharon's chuckle was low and sharp. "I reminded them that your doctor's report from last year was clean, that you handled the transaction entirely on your own, and that I've known you for 40 years. That pretty much shut the door." Helen's lips curved, though she didn't laugh. She never was very good at knowing when to stop. "She's going to run out of angles soon," Sharon said. "David's probably mortified." That was the one thing Helen didn't need confirmed. She hadn't heard from her son since the confrontation on the porch. No calls, no texts, just the silence of someone caught between two loyalties and unwilling to speak from either side. "I'll let you know if she tries anything else," Sharon added, "but I think we're past the dangerous part." When the call ended, Helen picked up her mug again and let the warmth seep into her hands. From her spot on the porch of the brick house, she had a perfect view of the Victorian across the street. A large, moving van was angled at the curb, the ramp down, and the new owners, smiling, chatty, clearly in sync, were carrying in boxes. A rolled carpet leaned against the porch railing, and a pair of wicker chairs waited to be taken inside. Helen sipped her coffee, content to watch without stepping in, the way you might admire a painting from a respectful distance. The house was theirs now. Every laugh that echoed from the porch, every scrape of furniture legs across the floors belonged to them, not her, or anyone in her family. By late morning, she noticed the curtains going up in the front parlor window. Not her heavy floral drapes, but something new. A bright, cheerful yellow with white trim, catching the sunlight like open petals. She smiled at the choice. It was the sort of boldness Henry would have pretended to hate, but secretly admired. A slow-moving car came into view at the far end of the street, and Helen didn't have to lean forward to know whose it was. Melissa's SUV crawled past the Victorian, the driver's window lowered just enough for her to see in, though the angle gave her little more than a glimpse of the curtain hems. Helen lifted her mug slightly, not in a wave, just enough to acknowledge that she'd seen. Whether Melissa noticed or not didn't matter. The SUV passed again in the late afternoon, then once more near dusk, each time at the same unhurried pace, as if repetition might reveal something the earlier circuits had missed. Helen made no move to hide when she was on the porch, but she didn't linger there either. Inside, the brick house was settling into its new role as hers, quiet, uncluttered, unshadowed by expectations. She unpacked another box that evening, the steady rhythm of it as satisfying as the tick of the mantel clock. But when the sound of an engine idling reached her from outside, longer, this time, closer, she paused, a book in her hands, and listened. 2 days later, Helen ducked into Carla's cafe for her first cup of coffee she hadn't brewed herself since the move. The little bell over the door gave its familiar chime, and the air inside carried the rich, comforting scent of roasted beans and cinnamon rolls. The early crowd had claimed their favorite tables, steaming mugs cupped between their hands as they caught up on the week's gossip. At the counter, Carla was sliding a plate of toast across to Mr. Henderson when Melissa's voice floated over from the corner. She was seated with 2 women Helen didn't recognize, her tone pitched just high enough to carry. "And of course, it was all very sudden," Melissa was saying. "She didn't even tell us she was thinking of selling. We could have worked something out, kept it in the family, but she rushed it, and now we're dealing with strangers living in a place that's been ours for decades." Helen didn't pause her steps, but she saw Carla's head turn sharply toward that table. "Melissa," Carla said in a tone so smooth it was almost gentle, "you forgot to mention that the house was in Helen's name alone, always was, and that she had every right to sell it to whoever she pleased." Melissa's smile tightened. "Well, of course, technically—" "Not technically," Carla cut in, still wearing that placid cafe owner expression. "Legally, and frankly, the new folks are thrilled with it. They told me themselves." She turned back to Helen, eyes warm. "Morning, Helen. Usual?" Helen gave a small nod, accepting the quiet victory Carla had handed her without stepping into the fight herself. By the time she'd left with her coffee, the cafe chatter had shifted to something else entirely, but she knew the correction would travel faster than any protest Melissa could make. In Cedar Falls, it always did. That afternoon, on her porch, Mrs. Phelps ambled by with her dachshund and gave Helen a conspiratorial smile. "Heard you played your cards just right," she said, as if commenting on the weather. "Good for you." Helen thanked her with the same calm she'd used when locking the Victorian's door for the last time. The next day, Tommy waved from across the street, calling, "Nicely done, Helen," before disappearing into his garage. Even the mailman lingered long enough to say, "Smart move," as he handed over her letters. It was the sort of recognition she hadn't sought but didn't mind, the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had refused to be cornered. Late that evening, her phone buzzed with a new message from David. "Hope you're happy." She stared at the words for a moment, hearing not anger in them, but weariness, a son caught between the woman he'd married and the mother who had just proven she could not be managed. Her reply was short. "Very." The next morning, Tommy stopped by with a long cardboard tube under his arm. "Figured you might want a hand with these," he said, tapping the end of the package. Inside were the curtains Helen had ordered weeks ago, a crisp, clean pattern of pale blue and cream. Together they measured, hammered, and hung them in the front window of the brick house, sunlight pouring through the fresh fabric. When they stepped back to admire the result, Helen felt an unexpected swell of satisfaction. These curtains belonged only to her, chosen for no one else's taste, and would never be subject to anyone else's tape measure. Across the street, the bright yellow drapes in the Victorian fluttered in the breeze, entirely out of her life now. She smiled, not at them, but at the thought that Melissa could look all she wanted and never cross that threshold again. Helen was clipping a few stems of lavender from the small bed beside her porch when she heard the measured click of heels on the sidewalk. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The rhythm was too deliberate, each step landing with the weight of someone rehearsing their entrance. "Morning, Helen," Melissa called, her voice pitched in that light, almost musical register people use when trying to soothe a skittish animal. Helen straightened slowly, brushing the bits of green from her fingers, and offered a polite nod. "Morning." Melissa stopped at the foot of the steps, hands clasped loosely in front of her. I was thinking, maybe we've both been a little quick to judge. You've had a lot going on, and I've been, well, concerned. I think we just misunderstood each other. Helen rested her hand on the porch railing, the lavender stems still held loosely between her fingers. Is that so? Yes, Melissa said, smiling with an effort that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've been thinking about how important it is for families to stick together, especially now. You've got that lovely new place, and I'm sure you've got plans for the future. She took one step up the porch. It would be good for us to be on the same page about those things. Helen didn't move from her spot. I think we're doing fine. Melissa's gaze darted past Helen into the living room, as though she could glean something from the arrangement of furniture. I want to make sure you're taken care of. If anything were to happen, we should probably talk about your will, how you'd like things arranged. Helen felt the corner of her mouth tilt upward, though her voice stayed perfectly even. The weather's turning warm earlier than I expected this year. The lilacs will probably bloom before the month's out. Melissa blinked, momentarily thrown off course. Yes, but I should probably finish getting these inside before they wilt, Helen said, lifting the lavender slightly. Would you excuse me? Melissa hesitated, clearly weighing the optics of pressing further, then forced another smile. Of course. We'll talk again soon. Helen watched her descend the steps and walk back toward the street, her pace measured, her shoulders a little too stiff for someone claiming reconciliation. Inside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. She set the lavender in a small vase on the kitchen windowsill and reached for the kettle. The phone rang just as the water began to hum. It was Maggie from the Historical Society, her voice low and a little conspiratorial. Saw Melissa at the cafe again this morning. She was asking questions about your health, your finances. Not outright, but you know the way she can slip things in. Helen felt the same measured calm she'd used on the porch settle over her again. Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate the warning. Just keep your guard up, Maggie said. She's not done. When the call ended, Helen set down the receiver and went to the front door. She slid the deadbolt into place, then turned the second lock until it clicked. After a pause, she checked the side door too, making sure each latch was firm. From the front window, she could see the street bathed in the amber light of late afternoon, nothing stirring but the leaves in the breeze. Still, she stood there a moment longer, watching, before letting the curtain fall back into place. Somewhere across town, Melissa was working on her next move. Helen intended to be ready for it. Helen was sweeping the porch when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel and glanced up to see David's sedan easing to the curb. He stepped out slowly, no Melissa in sight, one hand tucked in his pocket like a schoolboy who'd been summoned to the principal's office. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard in weeks. Helen leaned the broom against the rail. "Morning, David." He took the steps in 2 strides, but stopped short of the top, looking around at the tidy porch, the potted herbs by the steps, the clean lines of the brick house. "Nice place," he said, and then, after a pause, "I came to apologize." She tilted her head. "For what, exactly?" "For all of it," he said, letting out a long breath. "Melissa's behavior, my silence. I should have stepped in when things started to get tense, but I told myself it would blow over. That was a mistake." Helen studied him for a moment, noting the tightness in his shoulders, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "Trust doesn't snap back into place just because someone says sorry," she said evenly. "It has to be built again, piece by piece." He nodded, eyes dropping to the porch floorboards. "I know. I'm willing to do that, if you'll let me." Helen motioned toward the wicker chair opposite hers. "Sit, I'll get the coffee." A few minutes later they were both settled, mugs warming their hands, the morning sun stretching across the porch. For a while they didn't speak, letting the comfortable silence do some of the work. "You seem calmer here," David said finally. "Different than at the old place." Helen glanced out at the street, where the elm trees were just beginning to leaf out. "It's quieter," she said. "No echoes of someone else's plans rattling around. Every choice here is mine." He gave a small, almost sheepish smile. "I get that. They talked about small things then: Tommy's latest project in his garage, Carla's new pastry at the cafe, the weather. When David stood to go, he hesitated at the bottom of the steps. "Would you want to meet for lunch once a week? Just us?" Helen's answer came without hesitation. Yes. She watched him drive away, feeling a thread of something mend itself, not fully but enough to hold for now. 2 weeks later, she was watering the basil on her porch when she noticed a bright red "for sale" sign planted in the lawn of the Victorian. Her first reaction was a flicker of surprise, followed quickly by curiosity. The buyers, those cheerful, eager strangers, had barely been there a month. She called Sharon before the watering can was empty. "Any idea why they're selling already?" Sharon's voice carried the faint thrill of fresh gossip. "Job transfer, total fluke. They're moving back east. And before you ask, no, Melissa hasn't been near the place. Not once." Helen looked across the street at the yellow curtains fluttering in the parlor window. In a few weeks, they'd belong to someone else entirely. She smiled to herself, the morning sun warm on her face, and went back to watering the basil, already wondering who her next neighbors would be. The "for sale" sign stayed staked in the Victorian's front yard for 3 days before Helen noticed Melissa's SUV creeping by slower than usual. It was late afternoon, the light slipping into that honeyed hour when the brick of Helen's porch glowed warm under her bare feet. She leaned on the railing, coffee cup in hand, and watched the SUV idle just long enough for Melissa to see the sign clearly. Even from a distance, Helen could read the shift in her posture, a visible slump in the shoulders, as though a door she'd been pressing on for months had finally locked for good. Helen didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't offer the smallest acknowledgement. Melissa drove on without glancing toward the brick house. That evening David called, his voice easy, almost casual. "Guess you saw the sign," he said. "I did." "Melissa's taking it hard," he admitted, though without much conviction. "But honestly, I'm relieved. We can all stop pretending it's going to work out her way." Helen let the quiet stretch between them until David added, "I'm glad you're happy there." "I am," she said, and she meant it. The following Saturday, Helen set out her best teacups, the delicate white set Henry had once teased her for keeping "for company we never have," and arranged a plate of lemon bars on the kitchen table. Sharon arrived first, hair wine-tossed from the walk over, followed by Tommy with a jar of honey from his cousin's farm. Carla came last, bearing a tin of shortbread and a grin that said she'd brought stories as well as sweets. The sun poured in through the pale blue curtains Helen and Tommy had hung together, painting soft light over the table. They settled into their chairs, steam rising from the teapot, the easy hum of conversation filling the kitchen. Sharon raised her cup in a small salute. "To clean sails and quieter porches." Tommy chuckled. "And to strategic moves. I swear, Helen, you could have run reconnaissance in the army." Carla leaned in, her voice dropping into mock seriousness. "You do realize your curtain measurements are now officially part of Cedar Falls history, right? Half the town knows that story. I overheard a teenager in the cafe telling it like it was a spy caper." Helen laughed, a warm, unguarded sound that still surprised her when it came so easily. "If it keeps people entertained, I don't mind. Just make sure they get the ending right." "Oh, they do," Carla said. "The part where you outmaneuvered Melissa without ever raising your voice? That's the hook." The room broke into easy laughter, the kind that layered over years of shared favors, quiet alliances, and the comfort of knowing exactly where you stand with someone. From the kitchen window, the Victorian sat framed across the street, its yellow curtains still bright but destined soon for another owner's taste. Helen felt no pull toward it, no ache to reclaim, no curiosity about what the next chapter in its walls might hold. That house had been hers once, but this one, with its airy rooms and sunlight pooling on the floor, was hers in a way the Victorian had never been. As the conversation wound around to the upcoming summer fair, Helen reached for the teapot, refilling each cup. The clink of porcelain was steady, unhurried. Somewhere beyond the elm trees, Melissa might still be plotting, still searching for some angle. But here, in this kitchen with the people who mattered, Helen knew she had already closed the book on that particular story. And when the doorbell rang, sharp, unexpected, Helen rose to answer it with the calm of someone who no longer feared what might be waiting on the other side. The morning unfolded in the kind of soft quiet Helen had come to treasure. No footsteps pacing in the hall above her, no faint thud of a door closing somewhere she couldn't see, no phone calls that began with a bright voice and ended with a barb. She sat at her small kitchen table, a pot of Earl Grey steeping beside her, the newspaper folded neatly in half. Outside, the light was clean and clear, cutting sharp angles across the street and picking out the fresh green in the elm leaves. It wasn't until she carried her second cup of tea to the porch that she noticed the box truck parked in front of Melissa's house. Two men in matching navy shirts were moving briskly up and down the walk, their arms full of taped cartons and furniture wrapped in quilted pads. A dresser she recognized, oak with ornate pulls, disappeared into the truck's open maw. Helen settled into her wicker chair, the steam from her tea curling into the cool air. Across the street, Melissa emerged in a cream-colored sweater, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled into a ponytail that looked more functional than stylish. Even from here, Helen could see the strain around her mouth, the clipped movements as she pointed toward the truck. For a long minute, Melissa's attention was entirely on the movers, on the way they navigated her leather sofa through the doorway. Then she turned, and her gaze caught Helen sitting there, one hand wrapped around her mug. Helen didn't look away. She lifted her free hand in a slow, polite wave, the kind you might offer a casual acquaintance you'd bumped into at the post office. No edge, no triumph, just acknowledgement. Melissa's mouth tightened. She gave a brief nod before turning back to the men and rattling something off that made one of them glance at his watch. Helen took a sip of tea and let her attention drift back to the garden bed along the porch rail, where the lavender had put out a fresh flush of purple. The truck engine thrummed in the background, but it was as far from her life as the sound of gulls on the coast. Inside, the mantel clock chimed the half-hour. She rose, refreshed her tea, and stood for a moment at the kitchen window. From this angle, she could see the Victorian beyond Melissa's, still wearing its yellow curtains like a burst of late summer. The for sale sign gleamed white in the sun. The movers were nearly finished now, the truck door yawning wide to swallow the last few pieces of Melissa's life here. Helen thought of Henry then, unbidden but welcome, his grin when he'd tell her she was 3 moves ahead as usual. She could almost hear the dry amusement in his voice, could picture the way he'd tilt his head toward the scene across the street. "You'd have loved this ending," she said aloud, the words warm in her mouth. The breeze shifted, catching the pale blue curtains in the living room, so they bellied inward, light streaming through them in a soft wash. She reached out and smoothed the fabric between her fingers as she passed, the weave fine and strong beneath her touch. On the porch again, she settled back into her chair. Across the street, the movers swung the truck door shut with a metallic thunk. Melissa climbed into the passenger seat of a car that had been idling at the curb. The vehicle pulled away without so much as a backward glance. Helen let her gaze follow it only to the corner before turning back to her tea. The sunlight lay thick and golden over the quiet street, the brick under her feet holding its warmth. From here, the view has never been better.